Prince Edward stepped onto Balmoral's gravel with more at stake than ceremony. His and Sophie's arrival wasn't just another royal appearance. It was the front line of a quiet test. Balmoral, long viewed as a monarchy's sacred retreat, had turned into a... Behind closed doors, King Charles was navigating a monarchy in flux, his health uncertain, his circle tightening. A confidential letter, circulating only among the most trusted, cast out on other senior royals and elevated Edward as a silent cornerstone. If you love getting the real story behind the palace walls, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss an update. Sophie, meanwhile, moved through the castle's hold with a presence that drew comparisons to Queen Elizabeth, not in spectacle, but in steadfastness. Their presence signaled something deeper, a strategic recalibration built on quiet resilience. This was no routine engagement. It was Charles orchestrating a quiet reshuffle under the weight of legacy and trust. Amid internal rivalries and Camilla's fading grip on influence, Edward and Sophie's roles marked a shift toward moral endurance over hierarchy. As news broke of a journalist breaching Balmoral's inner circle, their reaction, measured, principled, unwavering, crystallized what Charles saw in them, guardians of monarchy that needed more than public approval. It needed internal integrity. Their elevation didn't just stabilize a house in turmoil, it defined a new standard. The gates of Balmoral swing open, and with them, the doors to a royal shakeup that no one saw coming. Edward and Sophie, long considered the low-drama duo of the Windsor clan, have just stepped into their first official state role at Balmoral Castle. But don't let the understated arrival fool you. This moment marks a seismic shift in the monarchy, and it's all happening behind the heavy, silent stone walls of the royal family's most private sanctuary. Balmoral isn't just a vacation spot. It's where truths tend to surface. The family's unspoken tensions, quiet alliances, and subtle power moves. This is where they all go to breathe, or combust. And now, in the wake of King Charles's health issues and a palace gripped by uncertainty, Balmoral has transformed into something more than a royal getaway. It's a proving ground. So when Edward and Sophie arrive, they're not just showing up for duty. They are stepping onto a stage where loyalty is currency and legacy is constantly... If you love getting the real story behind the palace walls, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss an update. Let's be clear, this isn't just about ribbon cutting and photo ops. King Charles has made a very deliberate move. Elevating Edward and Sophie isn't ceremonial, it's strategic. In a palace landscape riddled with anxiety about succession, loyalty, and influence, the choice to bring in the steady hands of Edward and Sophie sends a message. The king wants stability, he wants discretion, and he wants people he can trust. For Charles, that trust is increasingly hard to come by. Inside the royal household, dynamics are shifting. Old power players feel the tide turning. Whispers of rivalry swirl quietly around the halls, especially as Sophie steps into a role that's far more visible and far more impactful than many anticipated. Her presence isn't loud. It doesn't have to be. There's a reason people are comparing her to Queen Elizabeth. Sophie carries that same kind of quiet strength, the kind that doesn't chase attention, but commands it anyway. She's diplomatic, composed, and by all appearances, deeply committed to the institution. In other words, she's everything the monarchy needs right, and not everyone's thrilled about that. Camilla, now queen consort, isn't exactly blending into the background. But as Sophie's profile rises and public admiration grows, there's an unmistakable tension brewing. Behind the polite smiles and curated images, Camilla is feeling something she hasn't felt in a long time: displacement. Her position may be secure on paper, but her influence? That's a different story. Because here's what's happening. The public is leaning into this idea of a monarchy grounded in humility, one where service and character matter more than spectacle. And Sophie? She's nailing that brief. The public sees it. The press sees it. And Charles, quietly, clearly sees it too. Meanwhile, Prince Edward stands beside her, playing a role just as crucial, but in a different register. He's not trying to be flashy. His strength is his consistency. Where others have chased headlines or crumbled under scrutiny, Edward has remained largely uncontroversial, loyal, grounded, and in these fragile times, that kind of reliability is more valuable than ever. So when Charles sends a private letter, yes, a real one, indicating that his trust in certain senior royals is faltering. It doesn't just confirm the shifting tides. It exposes them. The letter, discreet but telling, signals something huge. The lines of influence inside the monarchy are being redrawn. And they are not being redrawn based on birthright or seniority. They are being redrawn based on trust, on resilience, on character. Charles is reconfiguring the palace power structure. Not publicly, not officially, but methodically. And the appointment of Edward and Sophie to state roles at Balmoral is part of that. A test, a signal, and a safeguard. But just as this quiet revolution begins to find its footing, it's hit with an unexpected jolt. A journalist manages to breach Balmoral's sacred inner circle. Confidential information leaks to the press, exposing just how fragile the trust inside the palace really is. The very idea that someone could infiltrate such a deeply protected space sends shockwaves through the royal household. And suddenly, Edward and Sophie aren't just representing the monarchy, they're defending it. Because when loyalty is already being tested and private information starts slipping out, the optics matter. And in this case, the public response is everything. Edward and Sophie are seen as the adults in the room, the calm in the storm. Their composed reaction doesn't just preserve dignity, it reinforces trust. This is a moment that cements them as the faces of quiet resilience. As the royal family scrambles to maintain control, Charles makes another move, one that confirms everything we've been seeing unfold in the background. With minimal announcement and no tabloid fanfare, Edward and Sophie are formally recognized as guardians of the royal household. It's a title drenched in symbolism, and it's not just honorary. It's a declaration. This title means more than a new nameplate or ceremonial role. It represents a shift in how the monarchy wants to present itself. Not flashy, not power-hungry, but principled. And in selecting Edward and Sophie for this role, Charles isn't just rewarding loyalty, he's redefining leadership. Still, not everyone is clapping from the sidelines. Camilla's discomfort becomes harder to hide. Her influence is still there, but it's increasingly overshadowed. The Queen Consort's internal standing isn't collapsing, but it's being challenged in a way that's clearly unsettling. And she's not the only one watching the power shift with wary eyes. Inside the palace, this elevation of Edward and Sophie triggers an undercurrent of rivalry, the kind of quiet, passive-aggressive court politics the public rarely sees, but that insiders know all too well. Jealousy, paranoia, competing alliances. It's all playing out just beneath the surface. But not everyone's resisting the change. Catherine, Princess of Wales, quietly aligns herself with Sophie, not through big gestures or headlines, but through subtle, diplomatic support. It's a smart move. It signals unity, modernity, and a shared vision for the monarchy's future, one that's more about character than charisma. And with Charles' health remaining an ongoing concern, this alliance matters, because the next generation of royal leadership is already being shaped, whether the institution is ready or not. What's happening now isn't a palace coup. It's a palace recalibration. The monarchy is shedding its reliance on performance and refocusing on principles. And that's being modeled most clearly by Edward and Sophie. Their rise isn't loud or flashy, but it's happening. And the public response, both in the UK and globally, suggests people are here for it. They represent a new kind of royal image, one that feels steadier, more sincere, and honestly, a lot more sustainable in a world that's increasingly skeptical of tradition for tradition's sake. Balmoral, once a quiet retreat, is now the epicenter of transformation, a place where roles are being rewritten, where titles aren't just ceremonial, but symbolic of deeper trust, where the future of the monarchy isn't being shouted, it's being quietly built by those who've earned it. That's the real story. Because when a monarchy is vulnerable and the usual faces are no longer guaranteed the same reverence, the real test becomes about integrity, about who steps up without demanding the spotlight, who can carry the weight of tradition without weaponizing it, who can hold the institution together while everything inside it threatens to fray. Edward and Sophie didn't arrive at Balmoral for a photo op. They were sent there to signal a turning point. And now, as officially appointed guardians of the royal household, they are more than just trusted figures. They're the new standard. A quiet revolution has been unfolding behind the palace walls, one where resilience, loyalty, and discretion outweigh prestige and power. And now, that revolution has a face, or two. If you've been following the drama from the sidelines, now's the time to weigh in. What do you think of Sophie's rise and Camilla's discomfort? Is this the monarchy finally evolving, or just another PR maneuver with better optics? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe if you want to stay locked into the royal unraveling, and don't forget to like and share if you're as fascinated by the palace's quiet chaos as we are. Because let's be honest, no crown is ever passed without a little. So let's peel back the royal curtain just a bit more. Because of drama, it doesn't stop at titles. This Balmoral chapter may seem subtle on the surface, but under the polished smiles and soft-focused portraits, the monarchy is undergoing a transformation that's anything but cosmetic. It's institutional, it's emotional, and it's personal. See, when Charles made a decision to send Edward and Sophie north, not just a visit, but to take on a state role, he wasn't playing the usual ceremonial chess. This was a move made under pressure, under the weight of uncertainty, and very likely under the shadow of his own mortality. With his health in question and public confidence in the monarchy wobbling, Charles didn't reach for the loudest voices or the most glamorous figures. He chose consistency. He chose a pair who've never once tried to steal the spotlight, but now find themselves standing directly in it. Because this is what makes Balmoral different. It's not where the monarchy performs, it's where it recalibrates, where the true dynamics take shape, far from press conferences and palace balconies. And it's here that Charles quietly began reorganizing the very foundation of royal influence. That covert letter, it wasn't just a personal note. It was a red line, a signal that the old guard is being audited. Those who've grown too entitled, too self-serving, or too politically reckless. They are being watched, and, in some cases, sidelined. That's why the elevation of Edward and Sophie hit so hard. It's not just about rewarding loyalty, it's about isolating weakness. And certain senior royals are definitely feeling the pressure. The leak at Balmoral made that crystal clear. When that journalist somehow infiltrated the most sacred royal space, the place where even cameras dare not tread, it shattered the illusion of internal security. It didn't just expose information. It exposed fragility. Someone inside the walls opened a door that was never meant to be cracked. And the timing? Suspiciously perfect. It happens just as Charles is trying to streamline loyalty, just as Edward and Sophie are being tested, just as internal trust is being reshuffled like a very expensive, very dysfunctional deck of cards. That breach didn't just threaten privacy, it threatened the entire strategy. Because if a monarchy is built on tradition and trust, what happens when both start to erode? Well, enter Edward and Sophie. In the midst of the leaked chaos, they don't lash out. They don't retreat. They hold the line. And that's exactly what the monarchy needed in that moment. Dignity, not damage control. Sophie's quiet strength, Edward's stoic composure. They weren't just doing PR. They were modeling what the institution wants to be seen as calm, principled, and unshakable. And the public? They noticed. There was a noticeable shift in tone. Coverage softened. Support grew. Even skeptical voices began to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, these two represented something the monarchy had been missing: authenticity. Which brings us to the announcement. The Guardians of the Royal Household title doesn't sound flashy. That's the point. It sounds old world, sturdy, grounded, like something rooted in history and responsibility, not headlines. But make no mistake, this was a big deal. It wasn't about power in the traditional sense. It was about custodianship, about being the moral compass in a sea of shifting alliances and quiet ambition. And by giving that title to Edward and Sophie, Charles didn't just make a personnel decision. He made a statement about values, about direction, about the kind of monarchy he's trying to leave behind. Camilla, however, didn't see it that way. Behind the scenes, the word is unease, subtle slights, a colder tone, reduced involvement. Nothing dramatic enough to spark headlines, but if you know how these dynamics work, you know. Camilla has been holding court as queen consort, but Sophie's rise is a different kind of threat. Not overt, not combative, but quietly popular, and increasingly essential. And that's the worst kind of competition, the one you can't publicly criticize without looking insecure. Now add in Catherine, the Princess of Wales, who, in classic Kate fashion, plays her hand perfectly. No grand gestures, just carefully coordinated unity. Attending events with Sophie, echoing support in interviews, even matching wardrobes just enough to suggest alignment. It's strategic solidarity. And it works. The public sees a team. A calm, competent, future-facing team. And in a family that's been battered by scandal and drama from nearly every direction, this alliance is golden. But don't think this is all smooth sailing. Because even as Edward and Sophie rise, and Charles draws his new lines of trust, there's still tension simmering just under the royal floorboards. The monarchy, as it stands, is being held together by dignity, PR discipline, and a whole lot of hope. The structure may look intact, but cracks are visible to anyone really paying attention. Internal factions aren't going away. Rivalries are only getting more sophisticated. And every elevation, every new role or shift in influence, comes at someone else's expense. So while Edward and Sophie now carry the symbolic weight of guardianship, that title also makes them targets. Because with power, even quiet, humble power, comes scrutiny. Those who've coasted on title alone are now being compared to a couple who built their reputation through consistency, through not being dramatic, through showing up and staying out of the tabloids. And that comparison? It stings, especially for royals who built their influence on being the center of attention. It also changes the stakes, because now, the monarchy has a model for the future, and it looks a lot more like Edward and Sophie than it does the traditional senior power players. Titles still matter, of course, but moral capital? That's the real currency now, and the palace knows it. There's a quiet urgency driving all of this. Charles is working against the clock, not just because of his health, but because of a rapidly changing public. People no longer tolerate the kind of spectacle-based leadership that once defined royal influence. They want humility. They want stability. They want purpose. And that's why this Balmoral chapter matters. Because it marks a shift, not with fireworks, but with whispers. Edward and Sophie didn't demand the spotlight. They were handed it because they earned trust when trust was scarce. Because they've proven they don't just wear the monarchy, they uphold it. And now, they are the faces of a very different royal future. One that doesn't center around charisma or drama. One that values service, integrity, and, honestly, survival. So as the monarchy quietly reshapes itself within the stone walls of Balmoral, the big question hangs in the air. Is this a temporary pivot, or the beginning of a new royal era? You've seen the headlines. You've followed the quiet promotions and the loudest silences. You've watched Sophie go from background player to central figure. You've seen Edward, often overlooked, become the symbol of quiet endurance. This isn't about nostalgia. It's about necessity. Because in a world that no longer gives royalty a free pass, only those who adapt survive. And if this past chapter has proven anything, it's that Edward and Sophie are no longer just part of the royal furniture. They are part of the royal... Here's the thing about royal transitions. They never announce themselves with sirens. They unfold in slow, silent gestures. A title here, a photo up there, a reshuffling of who gets invited to Balmoral for business, not just leisure. And that's exactly what makes this moment so monumental. Edward and Sophie didn't climb the ranks by playing palace games. They stayed in their lane. They showed up, smiled when needed, and kept their heads down while others spun in and out of scandal. 4 years, they were the monarchy's best-kept secret, reliable, unglamorous, and quietly essential. Now, they are not just trusted. They are pivotal. King Charles isn't betting on flash. He's betting on the long game. And right now, the long game looks like two people who consistently put service above status and dignity above drama. Their rise to guardians of the royal household isn't just symbolic, it's tactical. Balmoral, once a retreat from duty, is now the staging ground for a new type of leadership. One that doesn't lean on crowns and carriages, but on character. And the fact that this shift is happening so discreetly, that's the most telling part. Because real influence in the royal family has never been about who speaks the loudest. It's about who's trusted when everything starts to wobble. And right now, the ground is shaking. Camilla feels it. Catherine senses it. And even the public, increasingly skeptical of traditional pomp, is starting to notice who the steady hands are. Let's not forget, this is happening while the monarchy is balancing on a tightrope. Between tradition and relevance. Between history and survival. between public fatigue and private dysfunction. That's why the internal leak at Balmoral hit so hard. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. It exposed the fractures, the risks, the vulnerability of an institution that, by design, doesn't do vulnerability. And in the middle of it all, Edward and Sophie, they didn't flinch, they didn't deflect, they leaned in, which tells you everything you need to know about where this is headed. The future of the monarchy isn't being built through palace proclamations. It's being forged in moments like this, when pressure mounts, and the people still standing on the loudest, but the most resilient. Their roles now come with expectations, with pressure, with scrutiny they've never really faced before. But what sets them apart is how uninterested they seem in chasing influence. It's what makes them believable, trustworthy, and in a family where images often outpace substance, that's a quiet revolution on its own. But don't be fooled, this isn't a fairy tale. Inside the palace, egos are bruised, lines of succession may be untouched on paper, but behind the scenes, everything's being renegotiated, not through open conflict, but through control of narrative, through proximity to the king, through public perception, especially in moments of crisis. The title of guardian might not come with a throne, but it comes with something much more relevant in 2025, influence without scandal, visibility without noise, purpose without spectacle. And maybe, that's a monarchy's only viable path, because the days of blind deference are over. People want authenticity. They want leadership that isn't just inherited, it's owned. And that's what makes this chapter at Balmoral more than a footnote. It's a blueprint. Sophie and Edward aren't rewriting the monarchy. They are reminding it what it should be. So now the spotlight's on them, whether they ask for it or not. And with Charles quietly handing over the keys to symbolic guardianship, the message is loud and clear. The future isn't being handed to those who demand it. It's being entrusted to those who've already proven they can carry it. And as always, the real intrigue, it's not in what's said. It's in what's not. Let us know your take in the comments. Are Edward and Sophie the royal reset button the firm desperately needs, or just a quiet interview before the next crisis? Like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because if history's any clue, Balmoral isn't done rewriting the rules just yet.